figures such as Plato. What is this illusion that we're living in? There's always Shankaracharya's famous analogy of a man who mistakes a rope for a snake. And I think most of us have heard this, but it's not quite clear what this means or how to apply it to our lives or how to relate it to many other esoteric ideas. And I think we can start with that. And I want to suggest an idea that definitely harks back to, I'm sorry, have I,
Yes, we can listen to you. Go on, please.
Okay, I'm sorry. I thought I clicked something and I thought I had disconnected myself. We can talk about illusion and Maya, and I want to suggest it in another slightly different terms, which is to say, there is something in the human mind that takes all of the elements that it gathers from the world through sense impressions and creates some kind of world out of it. I don't know that conventional psychology has any term for this, but I'm going to call it the world generator, because it is what's taking everything from outside and processing it into a world that you and I can see and think we understand. This is very, very ingenious. It does enable us sort of to function in the world, but we have no particular reason to believe it's at all complete or accurate in its presentation. And we can see this quite clearly by simply contemplating the idea of dreams. Now, a dream is an entire world of its own that most people would say is totally fabricated, totally subjective. It's quite incoherent and meaningless from when you wake up, because no one ever woke up and said, wow, last night I had a really normal dream. But while you're in it, it seems entirely real. Now, we could argue that, excuse me. The dog barks, and if you may not be able to hear it, but I can. Anyway, so there is this thing that creates a world around us. And I'm going to call it the world generator, because I don't know that there's any term in psychology that exactly corresponds to it. And to go back to the concept of illusion, we could say that this world generator is radically defective. Were there any people who might have noticed this before this, as we see Plato, Shankaracharya, obviously intuited something of the kind? It's possible also that the ancient Gnostics intuited this fact and gave a name to it. And those of you who are familiar with Gnostic writings will have heard of the Demiurge. Now, this Demiurge is a second-rate inferior god who is cut off from the one true God above, and have fabricated this rather unfortunate world. The word demiurge comes from the Greek demiurgos, which means craftsman. And I would suggest that when the Gnostics are talking about this demiurge, which they do extensively in their texts, although their texts are extremely cryptic, they are talking about this world generator. So they are, I suggest, saying not that there's some God up there in the stratosphere who's created this kind of world. I'm saying they're talking about our own cognition, which is radically defective and illusory. And this is very disturbing, because if you can't trust that, what can you trust? Descartes said, what if there is this God, this malign demon who's deluding me about everything? And he said, well, no, the good God wouldn't let that happen. But it may be the case that he was right. There is this daemon that is deluding us about everything, and it's embedded in our own cognition. As you see, this becomes more and more disturbing the more one thinks about it. But I think this is what is grounded, or what grounds the concept of illusion. Now, present-day psychology is coming to intuit this. There is a philosopher in Southern California whose name eludes me at the moment, who says that, well, all our sensations and our cognitions are basically geared for survival in an evolutionary sense. So there's a lot we're blocking out because it's irrelevant to us and survival on this plane. And I think we can go with that so far, but I'm suggesting that even our concept of evolution and life on this plane and survival is a product of this world generator. And where can we go from this? Well, in Christianity, there is the concept of the fall. And I think you can all agree with, or many of you can agree with me, in believing that viewing the myth of Genesis in any literal sense is really not possible. But in another sense, there is some profound truth to it. Because eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, well, how do you know good and evil? You experience it. You only know good and evil by experiencing it. And I can tell you infallibly about all of you, without any risk of refutation, that all of you, like everybody else on the planet, and including myself, have known some good and some evil in your lives. That means, according to the myth, the cosmic human, symbolized by Adam and Eve, wished to know good and evil. And again, a common trope in many myths is that this cosmic being was shattered and came to perceive itself in many tiny little parts, which is the individual selves that we believe ourselves to be. And this is, as we perceive it, we can call it A Course in Miracles, which is, I believe, a profound spiritual text. And I'm certainly not going to be able to talk at all about it in any great length. But it's this book, published originally in 1975, and you can read about it more in my book. But it calls this fragmented, separate sense of self, which is fundamentally delusory, the ego. This is not to be equated with the ego used in classic psychology, as in Freudian, Jungian, or whatever. The ego is what I've just called the world generator. It is fundamentally mad, and escaping its madness is, shall we say, our only way out. Does this make sense? Well, I think it makes sense, because all you have to do before you were coming to this lecture, and no doubt after, you're going to be on the internet, you're going to see specimens of madness all around the world. People behaving absolutely crazily. And there's a point at which you have to say, well, no, this is just mad. This is just simply mad. And these people aren't mad in the sense that they're being locked up, but the madness is equally real and probably all the more dangerous because they're not locked up. Where does this come from? Well, what I'm suggesting here is that it comes from this fundamental sense of isolation, which is delusory, and which possesses all of us to one degree or another. And overcoming this sense of fragmentation, realizing that, shall we say, we're all one cosmic human, is, shall we say, the way out. And in esoteric Christianity, this cosmic human in its present fallen state is known as Adam. In its restored state, which is yet to come, it is called Christ. For as in Adam all men die, so shall all in Christ be made alive. So the question is, how do you, and overcoming the old Adam, I mean, is a phrase that one often hears in Christian mysticism. And it really makes very little sense, I believe, unless you understand it in this way. So that is, shall we say, the task that's before us. As I suggest in my book, using A Course in Miracles, well, what is the best way out of this? Well, you can call it forgiveness, and that's one way of looking at it, if forgiveness wasn't such a loaded word. Because I don't know in your native languages what your equivalent for forgiveness is or connotes, but in English, it often connotes a kind of sanctimonious pardoning. Like, I forgive you, is often an obnoxious thing to say. So it can't be forgiveness in this sense. But it might be better to speak of it in terms of, at the very least, taking the world we see somewhat less seriously and substituting love, compassion, kindness, all of the theosophical ideals that you know and I'm quite sure practice, and substituting these for evil and hatred and whatever. So it becomes logical to do this. That is to say, all of the evil and hatred is delusory, it's false. There's no justification for it. And it makes it much easier to overcome these things if we realize, wow, that's really crazy. Of course, it's much easier to see in other people than it is in ourselves. There's no question about that, and there are elaborate reasons for that, which I'm not going to be able to get into. But we have to start seeing this, like my hatred, my judgments of everybody are fundamentally delusory, and they have nothing to do with anything. So in that way, one comes toward restoring the cosmic human. So that touches upon some of the things that I said I would discuss, notably the cosmic human and forgiveness. But you don't have to buy all of this. That is one, shall we say, justification for forgiveness, and I believe it's the more profound one. But maybe you don't want to buy that. Maybe you think, well, here's a book that talks about, my other book called The Deal, is about forgiveness. And it doesn't say any of the things that I've just said. It approaches it from maybe a more, well, understandably theosophical perspective, because all of you, I believe, are familiar with the notion of karma. And karma, which we often in the West like, because it seems fundamentally more just than the insane idea that God would condemn anybody to hell for eternity for a few decades of offenses. That's just insane. I mean, that's even insane in our own terms. And more people are coming to realize this. The Theosophical Doctrine of Karma, which comes out of Hinduism and Buddhism, as you know, is more sensible in that, well, at least, it's tit for tat. I mean, crudely understood, you murdered somebody in a previous life, and very likely means you're going to get murdered in this life or some other. That's often how it's understood. It's totally quid pro quo, exact balancing of the scales. And although, as I say, in the West, we find it somewhat more consoling than the ridiculous doctrine of eternal damnation, it often in the East, it's regarded as kind of a monstrous thing in its own right. The scales are always weighed over. What do you know what you did in a previous life? What do you know it's hanging over you? What crimes you committed? And are the diseases, the crimes, the sufferings, the accidents you inflict, are they compensations for things you did in the past? Well, by this theory, yes. And then, of course, like, what's going to come next? Who the hell knows what I did in a previous life to deserve what may come? So what is the way out of this? And there is really only one way out of this, which is to use a loophole in the law of karma. And I didn't discover this loophole. It's arguably Jesus Christ did. Forgive us our debts as we have forgiven our debtors. That is a literal English translation of the Greek of the New Testament. And of course, what's the way out of the law of karma? Well, if I forgive others, I, by the immutable, inflexible law of karma, am also entitled to forgiveness. In a sense, it's the only way of clearing your own karma. So whether you want to take my rather elaborate metaphysical concept of forgiveness, as I elucidated it in the first part of this talk, or this more, well, superficially understandable and accessible form of just clearing your own karma, it all points to forgiveness. And so that is perhaps one major part of the spiritual path as we may wish to pursue it. So those are some of the fundamental ideas in my book. I'm going to talk a little bit more, depending on, I have a little bit more time, about if this universe is, our cognition of this universe is defective, what forms does it take? Well, these are ideas that I've gotten both from the classic Kabbalistic text, the Sefer Yetzirah, and some of the ideas of Kant, which are the structures that we place upon reality are part of these bounds. The Sefer Yetzirah suggests that we live in a world of, well, 5 dimensions. And 3 of these are the familiar spatial dimensions. One of these is the dimension of time, which we experience as a single dimension. It's just a line we're on. And then there's another dimension. It alludes to good and evil. The boundless good, the boundless evil, the boundless beginning, the boundless end, the boundless above. And that is the way it refers to those things. So the 5th dimension is a kind of moral dimension, in a way, because if you just take the 4 dimensions without this, they're totally static. So this universe has to have a 5th dimension, which is movement. And movement involves good and evil. Why? You move toward what you perceive to be good, at least at any given moment, and move away from what you perceive to be evil, again, at any given moment. Obviously, it gets a lot more complex than this. But motion is, in a sense, determined by the benefits you think there might be in motion. You wouldn't even bother to get up and go into the next room if in some way you didn't think you would benefit from it. So these are parts of this construct, and it becomes very, very hard to visualize a world around it without it, because these things are so basic to our understanding of things. I suggest that you can't even imagine, or most of us cannot imagine, a world that's even desirable without some element of evil in it. How can I prove this? Well, how many times have you heard people say, this heaven as conceived, it's like, this just sounds boring. I mean, what are you going to do? Sit up there on clouds and play the harp for eternity? Or, maybe a little more naturalistic version where, well, it's all just a beautiful garden with lots of fruit and lions and tigers to pet. Beyond a certain point, this just doesn't seem desirable at all. It's just not interesting enough. Now, is heaven like that? Or if you like, Devachan like that? No, I don't think so. But I'm just saying that even to conceive of a world that's at all interesting and something you want to be in, we have to have some, evil in it. Again, this is delusory, but it points to the fact that these delusions are kind of fundamental to our understanding of reality. Now, I haven't talked a lot about theosophical ideas per se, except karma and Devachan. So how does all of this relate to what one might call the theosophical myth, whereby the infinite, shall we say, emanates any number of monads, which migrate into materiality and, following the rounds and globes and so on, migrate out of it. I don't see there's a fundamental difference here in basic structure. In both cases, you have a descent into something that we call matter, and what that is a long subject in itself, and an eventual arising from it. In a Christian sense, it's viewed as fall and deliverance and salvation. In a theosophical sense, it's viewed as involution and evolution. So I think these processes are basically the same. And the language differs, the concepts differ, the myth differs, if you like, simply because these are realities that, if anything that I've said up to this point is true, are pointing to realities that are far beyond our capacities to imagine them with the ordinary mind. So the fact that it's portrayed one way in one tradition and an analogous but not totally similar way in another tradition really isn't a problem. They're both views of a reality that we, in our kind of delusory state of cognition, can't really grasp. So there's not a contradiction here. And again, I think both with this and with many, many other traditional mystical teachings, it's much more profitable to view them as all perspectives on an ultimate reality, rather than this one is right and this one is wrong. I mean, I think the Hindus recognize this because there are 6 darshans, orthodox views of Hinduism, according to, or Sanat Dharma, whatever you want to call it. 6 darshans, the Vedanta and yoga are the 2 that we know the best. Samkhya is another, and so on, so on, so on. Well, these darshans, I believe, could be usually translated, it's view, but I think it could just mean perspectives. And I think the Hindus were right in saying, well, these are all different perspectives on the ultimate wisdom portrayed in or symbolized by the Vedas. They're all just different perspectives, and they all are owed their degree of legitimacy. And I think if we approach not only whatever tradition we may believe in, but everyone else's traditions in this way, which is, I think both liberating and humbling, because I think we all have to look. I think we all have to come to the realization here that nobody has the absolute truth, and there's always further to go, and there's always more to know. And I think part of the spiritual path, as conceived of in Theosophy and in many other traditions, is a means of opening the mind, freeing it, liberating it, enlightening it. Those are the terms used. And I think taking this more open-minded perspective, granting the possibility that all of these things may be so and may all be different pictures of the same thing, is, to put it in one word, simply healthy. It's been about a half hour, and I understand that I have 45 minutes. So perhaps it would be a good idea to open up for questions and discussion the rest of the time.
All right, thank you very much, Richard, for your presentation. We are opening now for questions and discussions.
I have a question to ask.
Yes, please.